Fraser Commission of 1908 and 1909 by Dr. Paul Wanyeki. Welcome to our today's lecture. Kenya has a long and rich history of education commissions. In this lecture, we are going to look at the first ever education commission in Kenya. This was commissioned in 1908 and laid the foundation of TVET education for blacks in Kenya. In our last lesson, we looked at the influence of Thomas Babington's statements and Governor Elliot in the growth of TVET for Africans and Kenya in particular. By the end of this lecture, we should be able to discuss history of TVET between 1908 and 1917. 2. Analyze the impact of Fraser Commission to the growth of TVET in Kenya. In 1908, the missionaries formed a joint committee on education that later became the Missionary Board of Education, representing all the Protestant missions in the British Protectorate. In 1909, the British government equally established an education board, with Henry Scott of the Church of Scotland Mission serving as the chair. Fraser Commission coincided with formation of Missionary Board of Education and Government Board of Education in 1909. Professor J. Nelson Fraser of Bombay was commissioned by Sir Gerald Edward Percy to recommend a structure of education in the East Africa Protectorate. Sir Gerald was the governor of Kenya between 1909 and 1912, and it should be noted that Professor Nelson had done some work on education in India. Therefore, he had the inclination of education for colonization. Professor Nelson was influenced by the work of Booker T. Washington, who was the leading scholar for black education in American South. He was leading the emancipation of the black man in American South, while W.E.B. Du Bois was leading the emancipation of African education in American North. Mr. Booker T. Washington was of the opinion that emancipation of the Africans should not be confrontational, but should be diplomatic through acquisition of wealth and education and proving themselves to the whites that they are equal rather than confrontation. Mr. Booker T. Washington was of the position that the freed Negro should be educated and trained to work as skilled laborers in the white-dominated economy. This influenced Professor J. Nelson Fraser decisions and recommendations during the commission. Mr. Booker T. was for the notion that the Negro mind could not accommodate the complex European education, hence became second-class citizen in American white. This became the colonial government education philosophy. Washington believed that African Americans could concentrate all their energies on industrial education, accumulation of wealth, and conciliation of the South. Most of these pronouncements were made during the Atlanta Address. He argued that the surest way for blacks to gain equal social rights was to demonstrate industry thrift, intelligence, and property. Booker T. had very big impact and achieved a lot in regard to emancipation of the blacks in American South, and education for the black. He achieved this through his rich network of powerful friends and rich friends whom he convinced to form educational foundations that funded education for the blacks. Through this, Booker T-inspired foundations helped fund and build over 5,000 schools for the blacks. The most recognized one was the one that he himself established, which was Tuskegee Institute for the blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois' critique to Booker T. Washington was criticized by civil rights leader and National Association for Advancement of Colored People founder W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and his supporters opposed the Atlanta Address and labeled it the Atlanta Compromise because it suggested that African Americans should work for and submit to white political rule. He went further and labeled Washington as the Great Accommodator. Du Bois insisted on full civil rights, due process of law, and increased political representation for African Americans, which he believed could only be achieved through activism and high education for African Americans. It should be noted that Washington was favoring technical and vocational education for the Africans because of the rural American South, where he was working towards advancement of education for the blacks, while Du Bois favored equal civil rights, equal voting rights, and high education for the African Americans. Fraser Commission inferred terms of reference. These terms were not explicitly stated. However, it can be inferred from Fraser's Commission work. The first term was explicitly stated, and the first term of reference was that Fraser was not to put forward the plan for literacy education of the natives. The second term, which is inferred, was that the Commission was to consider the possibility of developing industries among Africans. Then Africans could in turn provide technical skills and expertise to the industries. Also, the Commission was to consider developing the British Protectorate on racial lines. And the fourth consideration or term of reference which is inferred was that the Commission was to develop education system that will keep Africans being subordinate to the whites. The fifth inferred term of reference was that the Commission was to assault undesirable qualities like self-conceit, which is self-pride, and insolence, which is rudeness, that were assumed to follow from giving African literacy education. Fraser Commission Findings. This is the Fraser Commission sought to find opinions of settlers and government officials on how it should progress in recommending education. And from the submissions, these are the findings. 1, that the Commission should consider to offer religious teaching to Africans, a training in strict obedience to authority, and practical education of technical nature. The technical nature was the one to instill discipline and strict obedience to the Africans, and this in turn was to fight the perceived self-conceit and insolence that the Africans had. The second finding from the submission was that government to assist funding mission schools. The third was that to influence the Africans fully. the Europeans were to develop full influence of the Africans in terms of their culture and education system. Also, their next finding was that need for government missionary cooperation in education. Now let us look at the comparison between Fraser and Thomas recommendations. Fraser recommendation versus Thomas Babington recommendations that were laid in 1835. Babington recommended that African culture be replaced, and in the same spirit, Fraser recommended that we offer religious teaching to replace the African culture. Thomas Babington recommended that African educational system be replaced. To achieve that, Fraser recommended training to be in strict obedience to authority. Thomas Babington recommended that we make Africans think that all that is foreign is greater than African. To achieve that, Fraser recommended that we keep Africans being subordinate. And lastly, Thomas Babington recommended that we make Africans lose their self-esteem. To achieve that, Fraser recommended that whites assault undesirable qualities like self-conceit and insolence in Africans. Fraser Commission recommendations. Recommendation number 1. Provide Africans with industrial apprenticeship through legal contracts. This was appropriate and economical. Number 2. Replacing the relatively expensive Indian artisans by cheap African artisans. Recommendation number 3. Education facilities for Africans should be provided by mission societies. Any education, be it industrial or technical, was mischievous without morality and should therefore be accompanied by definite Christian instructions. Recommendation number 4. Establishment of a Department of Education and appointment of Director of Education. Recommendation number 5. Establishment of education on racial lines, namely European, Asian, and African education. Recommendation number 6. Europeans and Asian children were to be given an academic type of education. And recommendation number 7 was that African children were to acquire a technical and religious type of education. African education was to be industrial, religious, and agricultural in nature. Recommendation number 8. Government should give grant in aids to missionaries to assist them in their educational enterprise. Implementation of the Fraser Report. The governor concentrated on administering the technical education to the Africans to replace the expensive Indian labor force, which was the recommendation that was made by the report. The second thing to be implemented was the Educational Board approved Fraser's proposal relating to the administrative structure of educational system. Also, experimental grant in aids were offered to 8 mission schools for technical education. Also, the other thing that was implemented was the Department of Education was founded in 1911 with Mr. Or James Russell appointed Director of Education, a position he served until 1928. Also, the other recommendation that was implemented was that by 1912, industrial training in basic skill such as smelting, carpentry, agriculture, and typing was successfully underway. Also, the other thing that was implemented was at the end of 1912, the Education Department announced the small government school at Kitui, opened in 1909, be expanded. In 1913, a new government school was opened at Machakos. The Ukamba Native School was opened in 1914, Masai in 1918, Kajiado in 1925, Kericho in 1924, Kapsabet in 1925, Tambach in 1926, Kapenguria in 1927, Sigalagala in 1932, and also schools were opened in Thika and Coast following the process of implementing the Fraser recommendation. Also, government was opening these schools in areas that were not adequately served by the missionaries. Also, to be implemented was government subsidized education in missions offering technical education. And number 10, the Director of Education adopted a policy that took into account the African psychology and economic needs. In this, he made reference to Booker T for confirmation of his ideas on education for adoption. That is, education for the rural needs was implemented. Observation during the time. This is what was observed during that time. The first observation was that it was observed that if any literacy education is given to Africans, the children will be ruined because they would look for clerical jobs instead of entering manual field labor. Also, even after offering experimental grants in aid, government participation in African education remained minimal until 1920s. This was what was observed, that despite the recommendation, government support to schools remained minimal. Also, it was observed that colonial government was concerned in improving educational standards of the whites and Indians only, and not educational standards for the black. Also, it was observed that education was racial in nature, hence undermining the African dignity. Goals of education curriculum between 1911 and 1918. These goals are inferred and they were not explicitly stated in any document. Goal number 1, to promote settlers and missionaries' interests. Goal number 2, to train African in catechism, elementary practical skills in agriculture, carpentry, masonry, local administration, and other allied crafts. Thank you, and welcome to our next lesson, which will be on Education Commission of 1918.